Welcome to another A-Push video with Mr. Pate for Barlow High School. Today we're looking at Israel post-1948 and how it impacts what happens in the United States. So let's go. Suez Crisis in 1956. Okay, what we have drawn up here, just to kind of give you some perspective, we have the Mediterranean Sea, we have Egypt. This is obviously zoomed in quite significantly. The Sinai Peninsula, which is a part of Egypt. You have Israel here. You have the, well, I guess that would be a poor color choice. You have the kind of West Bank area here that is disputed territory. You have Jordan, you have Syria, you have Lebanon, you have Saudi Arabia. Here you have kind of what becomes the Gaza Strip. It's kind of disputed territory. And so that kind of gives you an idea of what you're looking at as a map. Okay, 1956, Gamal Nasser takes control. You've already read about this during the Eisenhower years, but we're going to kind of consolidate and put some things together. Nasser takes control, and he does what a lot of these third world guys do. They try and kick out foreign investors and companies and nationalize and basically help their people. I mean, the idea sometimes of the dictators is enrich themselves, but it's also thinking, why should foreigners profit from what our country has? Well, the foreigners invested in it when you didn't have any ability to do it. It's not like Nasser could have built the Suez Canal himself. I mean, this is a massive undertaking. One of the biggest canals in the world. And think about what it gives you. This gives you, like the Panama Canal, the ability to go from Europe and circumvent all of Africa and cut through toward India and Asia. That's really, really helpful. Just like the Panama Canal helps you avoid all of South America. It saves a lot of time. So you can imagine they're going to make a lot of money off of the Suez Canal. Nasser nationalizes this. There were French and British investors in a joint company that had built the Suez Canal. They collaborate with and conspire with Israel to drop the hammer on Egypt. Now, Israel's looking for a chance to drop the hammer. They weren't involved in the Suez Canal project. So the three of them launch a coordinated attack, and they're going to be bombing clear back to major cities like Cairo, strategically over here. You're going to have the French forces and British forces are going to kind of land and occupy in this whole area around the tip of the Suez Canal. They're going to kind of successfully, I guess green's probably not the best color for that. They're going to move along and take this area over. They're going to control the entire Sinai Peninsula. And their bombing raids, they have air superiority, and they're just thrashing on Egypt with a surprise attack. Now, hopefully what you remember from this is the Suez Crisis is going to be solved because the Soviet Union says if they don't get out of there, we're going to send in, we'll resupply Egypt, and this could widen into a larger war. But at the same time, the United States is saying, Israel, you got to back off. And, again, this is not in the spirit of the United Nations, Atlantic Charter, and all of these things the United States had prescribed to. They basically said, you won't launch a war of aggression. And so France and Britain and Israel all feel kind of stung like the United States. France and Britain are NATO allies. The U.S. has had Israel's back, and they don't support them in this case. But the Suez Crisis simmers down and is eventually going to end. Okay, well, keep in mind that as we move on to our second topic, the Six-Day War in 1967, well, things were not going so well. And this main conflict between Egypt and Israel had not really diminished. There was a high state of tension. Israel knew that any attack where they got wiped out would be the end of their country, so they were always on a high state of alert. The U.S. was always supplying them with a good supply of quality weapons. And this area down here is called the Straits of Tiran, and it's this little tiny region. It's kind of a bottleneck, and Egypt decides, they announced they're going to close this in 1967 and not allow Israel to use that as a port. Now, they still would have had some ability in the Mediterranean, but it would have really hurt them economically to have this happen. At the same time that this is going on, Egypt is on the Israeli border sending lots of troops, as are the Jordanians and the Syrians, thinking that, what does this look like? What would you assume if you're Israel? And they close you off economically, and then they're massing troops near your border on all sides. These are the same countries that all attacked us in 1948. It looks like the 20-year anniversary plan. They're going to do it again, and that's exactly what happens. Israel, however, has some strategic advantages that are massive. They have a fantastic U.S. given air force that's just gigantic and well-trained pilots. And so what they're going to do, they see this happening, instead of waiting to be attacked, they inform the United States they're going to attack first. Within 3 hours, their pilots come and annihilate on the ground with a surprise attack all of the Egyptian Air Force. Now, the Egyptians, with only ground forces, now going against a premier air force, granted it's not the size of the U.S. or the Soviet Union, but very well trained, high quality U.S. planes, they don't have a chance. And they don't have good enough anti-aircraft equipment to even deal with this. So within almost no time, Israel has basically, they start thrashing on the Egyptian ground forces and laying waste to them. Israel at this point, not even a day into the conflict, having trounced Egypt, it's basically over. They warn both Jordan and Syria to stay out of the conflict and not get involved. But those countries don't listen. They're going to get involved. And very quickly, Israel starts pushing back and using their air force effectively on both Syria and Jordan, and dropping the hammer on them as well. Now, as this happens, basically Israel then is going to ask the United States not to call for a ceasefire for a couple of days and give them more time to take over territory. And the United States allows this. They oblige. So when the ceasefire is finally called after 6 days, this is what has happened. All of the Sinai Peninsula to the Suez Canal has been taken by Israel. All of the forces have been destroyed, the Egyptians basically. So now the Straits of Tiran is non-issue because Israel has control of this whole territory on one side. They also take over control of the Gaza Strip from Egypt. This area that had been disputed but was controlled up to Jerusalem, which is right here, controlled by Jordan. They take all of this from Jordan, and then they take over the Golan Heights, which is like a strategic defensive area from Syria that gives them a better boundary because it's this mountainous region that would be harder to attack through. Now Israel says, okay, we feel safer. And then they announce, now the United States and other parties to this who are watching, they assumed that once this was over, the Israelis would demand some kind of reparations and peace treaty from Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, but they would give the land back. And Egypt says, we're not giving anything back. We're keeping the land from Jordan permanently, and we won't give back the Sinai Peninsula or the Golan Heights in Syria until we have that country sign a peace treaty acknowledging our right to exist, saying that we have peace and they won't attack us again. And those Arabic countries were not going to do that. So this 67 war is this 6-day war where Israel takes far more territory around all of its boundaries and has a greater defensive perimeter available. Of course, this is really angering the surrounding Middle East that the United States has supported Israel. Tensions are building. Egypt and Israel, things are not good as they've taken more territory from Egypt than anyone else. And that sets the stage for our next topic, the Yom Kippur War. So that leads us to our third topic, the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Yom Kippur was a Jewish holy day. And Gamal Nasser, who had been the antagonist for Egypt, their leader, against Israel during this period of time, he is now gone and replaced by Anwar Sadat. Now, Sadat comes in and says, all of these nice things, I want to make peace with Israel, we need to end this conflict, blah, blah, blah. But he has ulterior motives. Sadat is in fact going to be massing troops along the Suez border and have them there, but something has changed now. After détente had happened, the United States was not as concerned with they weren't trying to take over Middle Eastern countries, they just supplied them with some arms. This did not bother Henry Kissinger, who's basically running U.S. foreign policy at this time as Watergate's underway. Did not bother him as much. So Syria, on the border of their lost land, here we go again. They're going to want to get involved, and Egypt's going to want to get involved, and everybody's in the same game, trying to take over land. And what's going to happen with the 73 campaign is the Soviet Union has given massive amounts of anti-aircraft missiles, and they've given better aircraft and better tanks. And so Egypt now is in a situation where they have much greater resources to attack against Israel with. And they're going to launch this surprise attack after saying all these nice things and overtures toward peace, etc. Syria is going to attack into the Golan Heights, and they almost break through the Israeli defenses. Egypt is going to break through the Israeli defenses, and they are going to start racing across the Sinai Peninsula, and the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, is on their heels, and they start to actually break through just barely into Israel. Now, after 6 days of fighting, Egypt still had Israel on their heels. Henry Kissinger called for a ceasefire. Egypt refused. Israel accepted. And when Egypt refuses, Kissinger sends this massive new shipment of arms to Israel. And that basically allows Israel to turn the tide. And they not only are going to be successful in saving Israel. This is the closest really ever that Israel gets to being demolished and destroyed. They are going to turn back and roll back even further Syria and Egypt. And so what you see at the end of the war is now this entire section right here, even a little bit more territory is going to be taken over, added to the Sinai Peninsula as Israeli-controlled territory. They even take a larger section than they had previously in the Golan Heights. And when all of that has happened, essentially, basically a big problem is Saudi Arabia had warned the United States an attack could happen at some point, and if it does, you better not help them. Well, the United States did help them, saved Israel, but that's going to lead to retaliation. What does that retaliation look like? An oil embargo on the United States and Europe. Essentially, OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, many of which are in the Middle East, but not all, they refused to sell any oil to the United States or to European countries during this time. Now, the United States, unlike Europe, had its own oil reserves. So this leads to an energy crisis in the United States. It's devastating even on a higher level to Europe because they did not have their own oil reserves. It's going to spur the building of the Alaska pipeline. America had other oil reserves, but it still means that there's major gas rationing. You see in America that they're going to have, throughout the United States, depending on your license plate, different days you can go get gas. People are having to wait for hours in line to get gas. It's a nightmare. And it's going to have significant other impacts on the United States as well. The oil embargo, which leads to the energy crisis, this is going to cause rapid inflation in the United States. And you may remember from a couple of videos, well, I guess a couple of podcasts ago when we talked about the Great Society, and then also alluded to this last time on Vietnam on the video, there are some significant issues. As Johnson ups spending significantly, both with the Great Society and Vietnam, spending is going up. We talked about in the video, as well as the Great Society podcast, the inflation is an inevitable result of these things. And when inflation gets going and becomes this disaster, it has serious, this is only made worse. It's exacerbated by the situation with the oil, which causes even higher inflation. So with this rapid inflation ensuing, and you already had the United States having higher unemployment, a sluggish economy, a weakened dollar, and huge national debt and trade deficits developed during the end of the Johnson years. Vietnam is still not over. You're still seeing that going on, unfortunately. And so you have this massive problem where, yeah, this is great for Israel, and they've taken all this extra territory, but the United States is going to be crippled. So the economic problems really, this is the final blow. Johnson's Great Society in Vietnam, double whammy economically, really took the United States from a long run of prosperity post-World War II to this kind of deep recession. But then when you have the oil shocks and the energy crisis happen on top of that, it's going to create some economic situations that we'll talk about in a podcast that are really bad. And it's going to take the United States until the early 1980s to get out of it. So you're talking about basically a 15-year economic downturn that comes from the support of Israel, Vietnam, and the Great Society. That's all the time we have for today. Stay classy, Sam Barlow.